Well, full disclosure here, I am a Right Honorable Kim Campbell groupie because of the following. She was the first Minister of Defense who was a woman in a NATO country. She was the first woman head of government in North America. She was also the Minister of Justice. She's been a diplomat, a professor. She's on the board of the International Crisis Group, which does an enormous amount of track 2 diplomacy, and most of what they do is prevent things from happening, so you don't hear much about them. And she's a founding member and one of the leaders of the Club de Madrid, which is an organization of former heads of state and heads of government. So former heads of state and government have considered her to be a leader, as do I. And the mandate, one of the mandates of that organization has been, for some time, promoting the value of the rule of law and democracy. She's not new to this advocacy, and she has demonstrated excellence in leadership in this very subject. So it's really an honor to have the former Prime Minister of Canada. And I want to say something that I observed personally with Kim Campbell. I was involved in what was called the Middle Powers Initiative, where we were bringing middle power, advocating the strengthening of middle power countries as a bridge in the realm of nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament. So we had a delegation that went to see then sitting Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Jean Chrétien had beaten Prime Minister Campbell in the election. And the level of cordiality and just dignity and civility and all of the qualities that we have been talking about at this conference that she exhibited in the meeting with her political adversary, and respecting the process of democracy in action in Canada, and seeing that up close and seeing the way she behaved disarmingly. And it was just exemplary of the way politicians should act and the way all of us should act. Right Honorable Kim Campbell, please.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I should say that I must give you an updated bio because I've transitioned off the board of the crisis group. I think they call you an advisor or a senator or something after, but it is a wonderful organization. And it's one of those experiences where you learn so much more than you can ever impart. And it's very enriching. I want to say that the presentations today have been fantastic. And you all, you speak to my heart and you speak to my values. And Mark, the lawyer in the courtroom, that's the nexus between all that the rule of law means and how it impacts on citizens. And that skill and that patience and that energy is so important. And I admire it so much. And I admire what you've done. Jonathan's been talking for so long about these cases that it's a thrill and honor, even by Zoom, to meet you. And for Congressman Raskin, I'm obviously following that committee very strongly and what they are able to tell us, but it's a frightening story. And Suzanne Spalding, it's interesting, when I was a young woman, and maybe I should confess, I just had my 75th birthday in March. Oh, I hate to admit that. But I'm a baby boomer. I was born right after World War II in 47. And when I was growing up, the impression I had of Americans was that they did a lot of civics in school, that they seemed to actually be more knowledgeable about their civics than we were in Canada. And perhaps also because it was the theme of TV shows and movies and things, that Americans seem to be much more connected. And then, as you point out, it got sort of overshadowed by other things. And I am deeply concerned, not just about civics, about our ability to understand our own democratic institutions, but also about our history and the origins of some of the global institutions. And I want to just focus a little bit on America's role in the world, because many of the institutions that we have, whether it's NATO or the EU or the Bretton Woods institutions, et cetera, came in the wake of one of the worst cataclysms the world had ever experienced, World War II. And very often you need those kinds of things to focus people on reform and change. I am speaking to you from Italy, and there are a lot of Canadian war graves here. Many Americans don't realize how many Canadians were in World War II. But Canadian and American war graves here. And every Canadian who fought in World War II was a volunteer, because although we had conscription, no conscript could be sent overseas unless they volunteered. And I often look at those graves. My dad fought and was wounded here and happily survived. But I often think, what do we owe them? What we owe them is not to let it happen again. My dad used to say, we weren't heroes. We just knew there was a job that had to be done. And when you look at some of the documentaries about World War II, and there's a wonderful series on Netflix with the colorized footage and some very excellent commentators, you realize how close we came to losing that war. There were a lot of factors, actually happily mistakes made by people like Hitler, that allowed us to get ahead of it. But what we have was paid for with such a dear price. And as we get older, all of us have a span of history that's real to us. And I remember when I taught political science and suddenly realizing that my students didn't see history the way I did. There were things that were real for me that were not real for them. So when it comes to teaching civics, I think it's also important to try and regenerate an understanding among younger people and even among adults, because many adults are of a generation where maybe their parents were involved in war, but they weren't. To somehow the fragility and the rarity of many of these institutions. But I want to say something else too about the law. As Jonathan knows, I'm a passionate advocate for the rule of law. And I think the interesting thing about the law is at different times, different legal issues kind of rise to prominence. So, for example, when I was Minister of Justice and Attorney General, a man named Marc Lépine went into École Polytechnique in Montreal and murdered 14 women engineering students and shouted, "You're all feminists." And that just jolted the issue of gun control up into the top of the agenda in the Canadian justice issues. Similarly, other issues just make us think what you're dealing with now in terms of the aftermath of the 2020 election and the efforts that are being made off at the state level to change the rules of the game of the American electoral process. So this creates a different thing. But what we're also looking at, I wanted to say a couple of things about the war in Ukraine. I was a Soviet specialist in my youth, and I spent 3 months in the Soviet Union in 1972. And I've watched Putin with great alarm because I know where he comes from. And I read at one time that when he was in the KGB, he was not promoted above lieutenant colonel or lieutenant colonel, as you say, because his superiors thought he was too reckless. And if that doesn't keep you up at night, I don't know what will. But watching what's happening there is deeply frightening and has raised a lot of very interesting issues. And I just want to make a couple of observations about the law and what we who are lawyers and should be stewards of the rule of law can be thinking about. First of all, the law is a language. And when we speak this, when other nations or societies share our view of the law, we speak the same language. And that provides all sorts of wonderful opportunities so that we can create relationships, we can create agreements, we can cooperate in a way because we share the same values. The European Union has been a very interesting force for democracy promotion because as new countries wanted to join, they were presented with the acquis, which is the collection of policies and laws and reforms that they had to enter into in order to qualify for membership. You have to have reached a certain standard of democratic governance to be in there. Political reform is the hardest thing in any country. It's hard in a mature democracy. It's almost impossible in countries that are just beginning to become democracies. But having this package of policies made it possible for many countries to leapfrog over the challenges of the fight about political reform because they wanted to be part of the EU. And one of my friends, a former prime minister of Latvia, used to say that his negotiators would come back from Brussels and they'd say, we have to do this because Brussels says we have to do it. And he'd say, well, yeah, but we should do it because it's good for Latvia. But you'd never get it through Parliament just because it's good for Latvia. You had to have that quid pro quo. And so legal frameworks are incredibly important for allowing countries to communicate and to collaborate. And NATO, the NATO alliance, is a similar thing. And countries can't just join NATO. They have to have a certain level of political development. although even non-NATO countries often work with military cooperation, like the Finns and the Swedes, who are now thinking of joining. So I think when we see the work that's been done, particularly since World War II, in institution building around the world, and America has played a very important role in this. And I think Canada has been a great supporter because we're not powerful like the United States. So multilateralism is deeply embedded in our DNA because we can't go it alone. But all of these arrangements are tied together by legal agreements. And they're tied together by legal agreements between democratic countries whose leaders sign them, knowing that they have to be approved by their populations. In other words, so there is a kind of a legitimacy and a strength to those connections. And what we're seeing now with the invasion of Ukraine is so interesting. Two things. One is the extraordinary cooperation, and I have just such praise for President Biden and going back, because Donald Trump didn't understand what NATO was. He doesn't understand how hard it is to create those kinds of relationships, how hard it is for countries to agree to give up some of their sovereignty for a higher purpose. And the galvanizing of the NATO alliance to help Ukraine has been a wonderful thing to see. And it's partly based on the trust that comes from speaking the same legal and institutional language, knowing that you can trust, knowing that you can move quickly. And I think that's extremely important. And those of us who are lawyers have to understand how powerful that language is. And now what we're seeing is also new and kind of exciting and imaginative ways of using the law to fight economic warfare against Russia. The sanctions, I mean, that is really what it is. It's a very interesting use of legal tools to accomplish things that you want to accomplish without resorting to arms. And all of these tools, and I think it's extremely important, your country and my country are in the process of passing legislation to allow for the forfeiture of the resources of some of the people who've been sanctioned. And I think it's extremely important that that be done carefully and constitutionally and legally, and that be well-founded, because it's an important way of using our powers. But it's a kind of ironic thing that many of these people come to the United States and Canada and Britain and Europe because they want the benefit of the rule of law. They want to come there so they can be in societies where they have property rights and security of contracts and peaceful societies. And yet they are supporting a society that is prepared to undermine that. And as Suzanne Spalding said, there's been an ongoing effort on the part of Russia to undermine democracies, and not just in the United States, but all in the Western countries. So we're now in an interesting situation where the law is being used in new and interesting ways. It's not that we haven't had sanctions before, but I think the nature of the sanctions that we're seeing here is kind of new and different. And finally, I want to say that I was on a panel last night, actually, with former Chief Justice of Canada, our ambassador to the UN, and the former president of the International Criminal Court. And we were talking about war crimes and atrocities in Ukraine. And Jonathan and I had talked about whether, it's a good thing to indict Putin, and will that bring people closer together? And others have argued, no, it is really important to make those statements. But again, the other night on Christiane Amanpour's program, I saw her interview with Benjamin Ferencz, the last surviving prosecutor of the Nuremberg trials at 102. It was a joy to listen to him, the moral clarity. Again, the law is a language. And as lawyers, we have to work very hard to make sure that we don't just create what some people call victor's justice, that we create deeply principled uses of the law and frameworks of the law. But it is a tool that can be used in so many different ways. And as each new situation arises, new challenges arise, new issues in the law and new ways of looking at the law and using the law arise and allow us to accomplish our goals, to create a better society, using tools that are not destructive, but that are principled and that can achieve our goals. So I just want to say that it's a very important time to be a lawyer and to be thinking about the law, because we are finding new and imaginative ways of using it. And just as Mark said, in terms of what he's been dealing with, who'd have thunk it? Who would ever have imagined that an American litigator would be in court trying to defend electoral processes against a president who wanted to overturn an election? But every new challenge requires us to gird our legal loins and get out there and think, how can the law be used and how can legal process institutions be used to try and achieve the peace, achieve prosperity, achieve justice, protect democracy, and make the world a better place. So I just want to say that it's just so inspiring to me to hear all of you today, because you're all tiles in the mosaic of something very precious. It can be fragile. And, Churchill was right. Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others that have been tried. We have to be constantly trying to perfect it. But I am very, very proud and happy to be a lawyer. But I believe that as lawyers, we have this obligation to be stewards of the rule of law. And today, Jonathan, you have assembled some of the most remarkable stewards of the rule of law. And I am inspired by them. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation.
Well, it appears that time is not our friend, and I want to apologize for not having more space for Q&A. But I want to give some concluding remarks. They won't be long, but I think it's important. I think one of the most important points that was made was Suzanne Spalding's point of that individuals matter. And in authoritarian regimes, individuals don't matter. Only one individual matters. Because the whole model is that the individual doesn't have moral agency. And the idea of moral agency being expressed through the process of democracy is what gives people empowerment. It doesn't actually give them empowerment. We're born with that empowerment. And that's what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is essentially about. We are endowed with it as part of our humanity. And it is being challenged now by doctrines like sovereign democracy, which means democracy is defined by Vladimir Putin or Mr. Bolsonaro or Mr. Duterte, or individuals defining what rights and privileges they're willing to give their citizens. When the United States was created, it was created with a North Star that has really transformed humanity. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That certainly was not self-evident when he stated it. People of color were not included as citizens. Women were not included as citizens. White men without property were not included as citizens. But it has grown in its clarity since then, and our society and the world has grown in clarity, because what was behind it was a sense of the sacredness of every single individual, and a society based on that moral agency is essential for the future of humanity, because the choice before us is regimes in which that moral agency of the person is marginalized or honored. I believe that that vision of the moral agency of the individual is actually a spiritual calling. It says that part of the divine is in every person. And that's what's at stake. Make no, don't look away, because it is at risk. That's essentially what's at risk in the Ukraine today. That's essentially at risk when we don't honor treaties that we're part of, because that's our constitutional foundation, the Supremacy Clause. That's at stake when we have media defining the problem we have today as epistemological. There's people have different definitions of what's true or false. Well, people, in a free society, people can believe anything they want. But the way in which we guide our institutions and the way truth is discovered is how Mark Aronchek pointed it out. It's through the process of the rules of evidence presented in courts of law. 60 cases said, this is the truth for the purposes of our institution. Rejecting that is rejecting the very foundation of the moral agency of the individuals protected by the rule of law in our system. Now, who else better than lawyers in our society can explain this to the public? No other group of people have the knowledge that we as lawyers have, because we know that the freedom of contract depends on the ability of courts to enforce it. One of the great experiences I had in my life was during the height of the Cold War, being involved in bringing lawyers from the then Soviet Union to the United States with a group called Lawyers Alliance for World Security. I think Suzanne was part of that. And I'll never forget bringing those lawyers to see jury trials. And they told me, "You mean normal citizens participating in the administration of justice?" I said, "Yes." "How does it work where you are?" "Well, the trial is done and the judge calls the commissar." Because their courts were totally politicized. Then we took them to bankruptcy court. Well, bankruptcy court was a place where they would say, "You mean that a person in debt can seek refuge in the state from the rapaciousness of banks?" "Yes." And then they met US attorneys who were appointed in the political process. And they questioned, his name was Bazelon, was the US attorney in Philadelphia at the time. "Will you prosecute without partisanship?" "Absolutely." But this is what they really turned their heads around. When they met Judge Norma Shapiro, a federal district judge in Philadelphia, who was holding the city of Philadelphia in contempt of court for having 8 people in prison cells designed for 4 people. And they said, "What gives you the authority to do that?" She said, "Our Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. And I think putting 8 men in a cell for 4 is cruel and unusual." They said, "Well, where does it say that in the statutes?" She said, "No, that's my judgment. And I'm holding the state to account to my court." That idea that the state was subject to the rule of law, that the rule of law would be protected and honored by the state, that the state would pay the fine, that the state would honor the rule of law, that's what's at stake now, where we have people questioning that legitimacy. It's our job to explain why this is important to every individual in our country and for the whole world. That's our responsibility to ourselves and to the people. And it's not just the responsibility of the international law section. I think it's the responsibility of the American Bar Association as an institution to take on this job in a nonpartisan way, in a way that explains that over time, Republican conservatives and libertarians and liberal Democrats all have moral agency, but we have a methodology of giving that agency guardrails and protections, and that is the rule of law. That is our job, and I know that there are a lot of colleagues in our institution who will pick up the task and succeed. Thank you very much, and Nancy, thank you for letting us do this. Thank you.